For this new episode of Nullpunkt, I speak with the sociologist and genocide scholar Martin Shaw. Shaw was one of the first genocide scholars to call Israel's destruction of Gaza a genocide. In this conversation, we speak about the state of the field of genocide research and the degree to which it is applicable or ready to mobilize social movements and activism. Nullpunkt is a 100% independent interview podcast, and in order to continue the work we do the way we do it, we need your support. The best way you can do that is via Patreon. The link for that subscription is in here in the description, and thank you so much. Martin Shaw, thank you so much for joining us in the podcast.
My great pleasure.
You're a sociologist and a genocide scholar, and you've actually been one of the first genocide scholars in the aftermath of October 7th, 2023 to call the Gaza genocide a genocide, which I thought was remarkable because at this point many genocide scholars or other researchers in the scholarly community have come out and called it a genocide. But at the time, that was not at all a...
No, this was in October 2023. Yes,
right.
Yes.
Where did you publish this article?
In Byline Times in London.
Right.
Yes.
So yesterday I saw a lecture of yours in Potsdam where you started the lecture with a big PowerPoint screen, and the lead question was, what does it mean to call Gaza a genocide? Can you, in brief terms, what does it mean?
Well, it means that Israel is deliberately destroying Palestinian society in Gaza. That this is not an accidental consequence of a war, or even not just a deliberate consequence of a war, a deliberate excess of war. It is a policy of the Israeli state to destroy the Palestinian society in Gaza. I think this was already strongly evident in October 2023, which was why I came to that conclusion more or less at that time, because of the intensity of the destruction which was wreaked on Gaza within days of October the 7th, because of the very strong pronouncements of Israeli leaders from the Prime Minister and the President downwards through most of the leading figures in the Israeli government expressed their determination to attack the Palestinians, the Palestinian population of Gaza as a whole. So they're saying there are no innocent Palestinians, even the children.
You're saying not in part, but as a whole.
Yeah. So I mean, this to me rang all the warning signs, and of course, this was not only because of what they said and did at the time. It was because I understood the history. I understood that Israel, since its foundation, and indeed in the Zionist movement even before its the foundation of the state, had objectives to eliminate Palestinians, at least partially, from Palestine, that there had been the Nakba, the huge expulsion event of 1947-48, there had been the further expulsions in 1967, there had been the whole slow-motion genocide, as some people have called it, of the Palestinians in the occupied territories after 1967, and the acceleration of this, especially in Gaza, with the blockade of the previous 15 years, with the so-called mowing the grass, the very violent, destructive, murderous episodes through which Israel intended to teach the Palestinians in Gaza that they were still in control.
You're talking about the wars in 2009, 14, 2012, 21.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, because of all this, because of the Dahiya doctrine, the doctrine that Israel developed in its war in Lebanon in 2006, that said that it was legitimate and necessary to inflict disproportionate harm on the civilian population in retaliation for perceived attacks on Israel. So because of all these things, this rang for me big warning bells that Israel was embarking on a course of genocide.
Well, I think There's an article you wrote in the Journal for Genocide Research titled "The Genocide That Changed the World."
Yes.
Which I recommend everyone who's watching this to read this article. And there you also make the argument you made just now that actually the genocide against the Palestinians didn't necessarily start in 2023, but is, and I'm paraphrasing you here, yes?
Yes.
A continuation of a process that started much earlier, essentially with the massacres in 1948, the Nakba as we know it, leading up to kind of today. You call it incipient genocide in this article. And this is an argument I haven't really heard before any Western scholar make in that directness and in that clarity. I'm wondering what follows from that, you think, politically?
Well, I mean, first of all, maybe I could say something a little bit about how I came to develop this argument. I wasn't perhaps quite the first Western genocide scholar to say that Israel was pursuing a genocidal path. So Patrick Wolfe, the Australian scholar, wrote in 2006 an article about the eliminatory dimension of Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine, and he put the question of genocide on the agenda. And I, in 2007, I wrote about in my book "What is Genocide?" In passing, I wrote not in a great depth, but I wrote about the incipiently genocidal nature of the project of transferring the Palestinians out of most of Palestine, which Zionism had developed quite early on, even before 1948, and which was realized in large part in 1948, and which continues to drive a lot of Israeli thinking. So I had already developed this position, and it was in the period before 2023. This was very much an outlier position, I think, in genocide studies. There were not many of us. There were others who followed from Wolfe and me, but there were not many, and the field as a whole was not discussing it. So I think what follows from it politically, though, is that the question of genocide has to be looked at in the context of Israel as a whole. The Israeli state is based on genocidal history, and this isn't. It's important, of course, to be precise, to say that what happened in 1948 was essentially a genocidal mass expulsion. I say it's a genocidal mass expulsion because it involved the deliberate destruction of the Palestinian society in Gaza. And I understand genocide to be the deliberate destruction of the society. It isn't necessarily the extermination of a people. It isn't necessarily the mass killing of a people, although, of course, there was, as you mentioned, the massacres. There was certainly a good deal of mass killing in 1948. But the mass killing, in that case, it was essentially a means to accelerate the expulsion of the Palestinians. And there are many genocides like this. The genocide of the Rohingya in 2017 in Myanmar, the genocide in Bosnia in 1991-95, very much along the same lines. It's not an unusual pattern; it's a very common pattern. But it means that we have to look at the relationships between mass killing as one dimension of genocide and processes of expulsion and removal as another.
Right. So you're saying, like, the if I understand you correctly, the primary means by which a genocidal process was initiated in 48 and the decades leading up to following 48 was expulsion, also known as ethnic cleansing.
Well, ethnic cleansing is a term which was introduced into the international debate from the Bosnian War. It's a term that comes from the Serbo-Croatian language, and it was a perpetrator's term. It's a term through which
I've heard you problematize.
This was the context in which I first mentioned in 2007 mentioned the ideology of transfer in Zionism, because I understand, in the way that Raphael Lemkin, the founder of the idea of genocide, understood, I understand the forced removal of populations of one of the dimensions of genocide. He said, there are two ways in which genocide can be implemented. He said, that genocide involves the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor on the population, either on the population which remains in the territory, or by removal of the population. So he said these are the two main means of genocide: removal followed by colonization of the oppressor's own nationals. And so that's what we see in Palestine over in the Nakba. It's what we see in Palestine in a slower way, in a more gradual way, but accelerating in the West Bank since 1967, and especially in the 21st century, and especially in the years before 2023, and even more so since 2023. So for me, the question of genocide in Palestine is not only a question of what has happened since 2023. 2023, Gaza is a very, very big escalation. It is a transformation of the genocidal processes in Palestine, and it's a transformation which means that these genocidal processes, which in the previous period are in tension with with more normal sort of occupation, with more normalizing processes. So the Israelis at times want to normalize the occupation, to rule over the Palestinians, but they also have this idea of continuing to eliminate them, of progressively removing them from different parts of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and also maybe from Gaza. So this is the historic pattern, the tension between the, if you like, normal oppressive rule over a population by Israel, and the eliminatory dynamic. And the eliminatory dynamic becomes much greater in the 21st century, and it becomes much greater still, of course, after October 23. And really, this is a different phase of genocide that we have been in since 2023.
Well, if you've lived in Israel, or as I have, I've worked in Israel as a journalist in the past, and you mentioned normalization of occupation. I think that's anyone who has been in that society for an extended amount of time can attest to the fact that it's incredibly normalized. But at the same time, the arguments that are being echoed in Israeli society, especially in the media environment, after 23, I think that's on a whole level, another level. It's been accelerated and exacerbated, but it's often, and this is not my argument, but people would say, well, we have to defend ourselves, or make sure that Israel is secure. It's an argument of security, of securitization. Yes. We have to make sure that, and again, I'm paraphrasing here, but that these barbarian people aren't coming to kill us. And there is a sentiment that if Israel weren't to act strongly, and that goes back many decades, it would cease to exist. What do you say to this?
Well, I think the security dynamic is clearly a big part of it, and it's been a growing part of it, and it's very much a part of what's happened since 2023. But if we go back to 1967, if we look at what happened in the aftermath of 1967, within the first decade after that occupation, when Israel came to rule over more than 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza, Israeli settlements began. The colonizing process spread into the occupied territories.
You're saying after 67?
After
yes.
in the decade, at that time in a very small scale. But it has grown and grown and grown, and this is the other side of the process, isn't it? That it isn't that you can't say that what Israel has done to the Palestinians is simply a product of its paranoid security thinking. It's exaggeration of security. It's permanent security thinking, as Dirk Moses talks about it. The idea that
a guest on the podcast. Yes.
Yeah, you already talked to him. He talks about security, the security thinking as trying to eliminate future threats. So, and we see this, we hear this in the way Israeli leaders talk about the Palestinian children. The Palestinian children may grow up to be terrorists, so therefore we have to eliminate them too. That's been said. It was said in 2014 by one of Israeli ministers. It has been said very much since 2023. So that's a big part of it.
So even including people who may become quote unquote terrorists into the equation.
Yeah, but that's a part of it. That's a part of it. But that is because the Israelis know, at some level, deep down, they know that by colonizing Palestine, by driving out the vast majority of the Palestinians in 1948, by continuing to colonize, by introducing settlers on an increasingly large scale, but by those settlers themselves becoming, in some cases, terrorists who drive out Palestinians from their villages, from their homes, who use the courts with the support of all sorts of agencies of the Israeli states to remove Palestinians, even in East Jerusalem, for example. This ongoing process. I think they know that this produces a response. This produces a threat, and they can't really be surprised that it produces sometimes a violent threat. And indeed, in international law, the occupied population have the right to resist, including violently. So there is a relationship here between the settlement process, the colonization, the removal of the Palestinians, and the perceived threat. Although the threat, of course, is greatly exaggerated. The threat is greatly exaggerated.
So if I were to kind of sum up your argument, you're saying that the threat is in many ways a response to the policy.
Yes. Which colonized people have not resisted? In the course of recent centuries, we know from huge range of European colonial experience that in every colonized country, at some time there has been there has always been resistance. Sometimes it's not violent resistance. Sometimes it's civil resistance. And some people argue that can be more effective, at least in some circumstances. But nevertheless,
in Palestine, there is certainly all sorts of different types of resistance, from non-violent to violent, and I think the non-violent types often get overlooked in the international discussions about it. Yeah.
Well, that's right, and there are big debates to be had, I think, about what sort of resistance is most effective, and sociologists and political scientists have studied this and said that all things being equal, civil resistance can be more effective, but all things being equal is the operative term. There are all sorts of things that affect this equation, and it's not for me or for you or anybody else out in Europe to tell the Palestinians exactly how they must resist.
Just since we're already touching on this point, you have, and yet again, I find your position quite interesting because it sets you apart from many other people who have become sort of leading voices on these discussions. But you have not only very early called out Israel's genocide in Gaza as such, you have also described the nature of the attack of October 7th as genocidal in its character.
Yes.
I'm wondering, how do you characterize this, especially against the backdrop that, as you've just said, it is, however gruesome it was, and I think we agree that it was a war crime in many ways, but it was also a response to a settler colonial dynamic. So how do you explain the genocidal nature of October 7th?
Well, the Palestinians in Gaza have been subjected, as I was saying earlier, they have been subjected to blockade, to collective punishment, to terror, to massacres. I mean, I would say that these Israeli massacres in 2014, in 2008-9, for example, were already arguably genocidal massacres. This is terminology which has been developed in the field to talk about short, localized, massacres, committed in a limited context. So we know that in 2008 or in 2014, Israel didn't intend to destroy the whole of Gaza. They intended to destroy to parts of Gaza, to kill hundreds, maybe thousands of Palestinians, but in order to sort of reassert their control over the situation. The idea of mowing the grass expressed that, which is a very gruesome idea in itself. I think that essentially Hamas, by launching attacks on Israeli civilians, and it's quite clear to me that the operation on October 7th included the intention not only to take civilian hostages, which is itself a war crime, but also to kill and to attack civilians. Whether it was intended by the Hamas leadership to attack the music festival where hundreds of civilians were killed, I'm not sure about that. It seems as though maybe they didn't know that was happening. But nevertheless, the approach which they adopted to the event was such, and Hamas is a disciplined organisation, and I think the other organisations that took part are disciplined, that if the actions that their militants took in killing so many civilians must have been within the scope of the planning. I mean, we hear later the Hamas leaders say, we didn't intend to attack civilians. I don't take that much more seriously than I take it when Israeli leaders say that. I mean, it doesn't stack up any more than the Israeli leaders' claims stack up. So I think this was in the sense that the people were targeted as residents of Israel, in the most part as Israelis, although some non-Israelis were killed alongside them. This can be seen as genocidal in a very limited way. And now it's important, I think, to recognise the reason I think that why this is significant is that it helps to explain the Israeli response. Israel has carried out many brutal atrocities against Palestinians had done before 2023, as I was just talking about, but also in the West Bank in 1948, 1967, etc., etc. But they have never carried out the kind of killing and destruction operation that we have seen in the last 30 months in Gaza.
Right. In the article I mentioned earlier, you call it a counter-genocide, right?
Yes. This terminology is again a terminology which other genocide scholars have developed to talk about a situation where there is a sort of dynamic between different types of genocidal action. So the Hamas massacre is in a sense a response to the genocidal nature of some of the previous Israeli attacks.
So you could call it a counter genocide.
Yes, and the Israel,
not a funny topic.
Well, I mean, we know very much that. I mean, if you think about genocide as a deviant form of war, I mean, in war generally, we have these dynamics. The one side takes an action, the other side counteracts, and then there's an escalation. Well, here we're talking about the same thing, but in genocidal terms. And it is so important, I think, to understanding what Israel has done in the last 30 months, to understand that, to take seriously, actually, the fact that this was a huge provocation by Hamas. Maybe huger, maybe bigger, as it turned out, than they originally intended, but nevertheless, to attack Israeli civilians in a significant way, on a scale that must have been intended as well as actually happened, I think was a departure from what anything that Hamas had done or any Palestinian organization had done before. And given the disproportionate way in which Israel generally responds to Palestinian and other Arab armed attacks, I think it was obvious that Israel was going to respond in a very big way. I think that's what I immediately understood when I heard about October 7th. I thought, what is Israel going to do in response to this? I mean, I didn't know exactly, obviously, but I thought this is going to be much worse. It's going to be much bigger, and within a few days, I think that was very clear that was what was happening. And so initially, this is I think very much a revenge genocide. It's Israel responding to Hamas's limited massacres. Hamas killed less than 800, fewer than 800 Israeli civilians on October 7th. Overall, 1,100 and something Israelis, including military. 2.5 years later, Israel has killed, by incredible estimates, well over 100,000 Palestinian civilians. They have injured hundreds of thousands more. They have bereaved, 2 million people, because every family has lost so many people. I mean, this is on a scale that's completely outside what we had seen before in Israel-Palestine. And
just to jump back to the original question for a minute, and I'm not. I just want to clarify. I'm not asking this in order to kind of push back against your assessment. I'm just curious, like, when you describe the October 7th massacre as a genocidal massacre, does that imply that, so to speak, the settler colonial framework that is embedded into this massacre, the kind of response to settler colonialism, like the description of it as genocidal doesn't hinge on the question who dominates the dynamic, so to speak?
Well, this is again a question which has been discussed in the genocide literature. So it's not my invention.
Okay.
There is in the literature the idea of subaltern genocide, which is the idea that oppressed people can also commit genocide. For example, when the slaves rose up in Haiti in 1801, they massacred French planters and French civilians as well as military. When the Indian troops of the British Indian Army mutinied in 1857, they massacred British civilians as well as soldiers. And I was talking in the lecture yesterday about in Namibia in 1904, when the Herero rose up against the German imperial army in the colony of Southwest Africa. They massacred hundreds of German civilians as well as soldiers. So
you would say these are examples of genocide as well.
These are examples of subaltern genocide, but in each case, and this is really the critical thing from my understanding of Gaza, in each case they were followed by hugely greater repression by the colonizers. So it is a colonial dynamic. Colonization, with all its oppression, all its brutality, produces sometimes what we can call subaltern genocide, but it then produces a much greater genocidal repression from the colonizers, and so in this sense, Gaza is part of a pattern, and this is really what I was trying to get at.
Can I just ask, just to understand this? Let's put a little bit of flesh on the theory here, on the bone of theory, so to speak. Because when you explain it that way, are you referring back to Raphael Lemkin and the book of Axis Rule in Occupied Europe? Are you referring back to kind of the theory fundamentals, or are you referring to the way in which it has been translated into the UN Genocide Convention? And as a follow-up to that, also, like, I'm always curious, what I think, if I understood you correctly in your lecture, you elaborated on the fact that something got lost on the way in that translation process of the idea of genocide by Lemkin into the UN Convention. That, like, there was, for example, the idea of violence got depoliticized. That's something you argued yesterday in your lecture, and I'm just curious, like, in these contexts of like subaltern genocide, is this something you draw from Lemkin himself, or?
Well, I draw this primarily from genocide scholars, genocide historians, who, in the last 2 or 3 decades, there has been a big turn towards discussing colonial genocide, and so there has been a discussion of these problems, and it is a bigger significance, because it's not only the case that in some situations the colonized have massacred the colonizers, and that then the colonizers have responded. It's also that this has become part of the imaginary. And I was talking before about the way Israelis fear the Palestinians because they know what they have done to them. I mean, this is something which we find, I think, echoed throughout modern history. So we can talk about the fantasies that the Nazis had about the Jews as colonizing Germany. You know, they believed that the Germans had been colonized by the Jews.
Kind of old anti-Semitic tropes, yeah.
The British and the French and the Germans today, some of them believe that they are being colonized by Muslims and by immigrants. You know, by the non-white people who have come to settle in their countries. You know, the Great Replacement theory. So there are these, as well as the actual violence that in some situations the colonized inflict on the colonizers. There are the fantasies about this violence, and there are the perceptions of the threat, and these are also a very important dimension. So in this sense, the question of subaltern genocide is not only, in some cases, a reality, usually on a relatively small scale compared to colonial violence, but also a part of the ideological world of colonialism and of modern Western society.
I understand. You know, like Israeli society, very similarly to German society, and I think still many other Western societies, even though Germany and Israel are certainly on the forefront of that, they are very much in denial about the question of genocide, at least when people are asked publicly about this. I think privately they might already think differently. But in Germany, you know, as I'm sure you've seen, there's been exhibitions cancelled and people lost positions over using that vocabulary. Now, almost 3 years into the debate, that this is slowly changing, but the levels of denial are still very much prevalent. And at the same time, I think in activist circles, the genocide has become kind of a rallying cry for looking at Gaza, for trying to raise awareness for the fact that this society has been completely destroyed. I'm wondering, is there a danger in kind of establishing genocide as kind of, you know, something like a gold standard for suffering? Because I very much agree with you that Gaza is a genocide. But I'm kind of wondering if at this point, almost 3 years into it, the discussion about it is turning into a diversion from the reality on the ground. Something the right has been claiming from the very beginning. I'm kind of wondering if they're belatedly correct, because it's sort of like it's kind of suggests at this point as if like if it's not a genocide, it's not so bad.
Well, that's certainly what they want to say. I think it's interesting how how reactions on this issue have changed, because at the beginning, in October 2023, there were very few even genocide scholars like me who said there were others. Raz Segal, for example, also like me in the first week.
Textbook Case of Genocide, the famous article.
Yes. But many of my colleagues took months or even a year to come to the same conclusion. They have all now come to the same conclusion, more or less, including many Israeli and Jewish scholars. So I mean, this is now a very settled opinion, and it's a settled opinion among humanitarian organizations, like Amnesty, for example, who have produced a very scholarly report on the subject, and a United Nations report as well. So it is a very established position, and it's also the case that public opinion has shifted. So if you look at opinion polls, the majority, I think, of Germans, certainly of British and even Americans, will say yes, this is genocide. The recognition of the depths of the Israeli crimes has reached into most corners of society, even if most people don't really act on that knowledge, and they don't take seriously, if you like, the implications of recognizing it. But they recognize, despite all the attempts that Israel has made to suppress the knowledge, killing the Palestinian journalists, blocking the international journalists from going into Gaza, all the efforts of the the Israeli propaganda machine throughout the world, which is really a very substantial propaganda machine, reinforced by official positions of European governments like the German and the British and the French, the American government, the editorial positions of most of the major media. Despite all of this, people believe it's a genocide. And I think this is the reason why, on the one hand, the Palestinian pro-Palestinian the cause has rallied to genocide as the clearest, the strongest recognition of the total atrocity that Israel has created in Gaza. And on the other hand, the Zionist and pro-Israeli forces in Western societies have doubled down on their denial of genocide in particular. But I think scratch the surface and you will find that the people who deny genocide today mostly would also deny that there are serious war crimes, that they would deny that there are crimes against humanity. They would not support sending Benjamin Netanyahu to The Hague to answer those charges which the International Criminal Court have brought against him. So, it isn't that they are recognizing Israeli atrocities but saying it's a different name. They are, on the whole, I think, people who do not recognize Israel's atrocities at all or to any serious extent.
Well, I think in Germany the argument you often hear is that people would say, yes, Israel acted disproportionately. Yes, there might have been war crimes, but using the language of genocide evokes imagery and suggestive language that equates Jews and Nazis. I'm again paraphrasing arguments I often hear in the German media environment.
Yes,
but the kind of evocation of genocide as a crime would bring Israel dangerously close to the Holocaust, that the Nazi genocide.
Yes.
So,
yes. Clearly there is a failure of understanding here. Not very many people have thought long and hard about the meaning of genocide. I'm one of those who claim to have done so, but
can't take that away from you.
not even all genocide scholars think a great deal about the meaning. A lot of them simply study cases and interpret, often according to the International Genocide Convention criteria. This I think is one of the reasons why there was a slowness in recognizing what Israel was doing, because the most destructive phase of Israel's campaign was in the very first months. Ras Sigel and I were not wrong about what was going on, but it took time for people to recognize that, and as it has gone on, I think we now have the problem really that some people in the wider community, maybe not in the genocide field, are still equating genocide with the Holocaust. They're saying, if it's not like the Holocaust, it's not genocide. And that is really not how genocide, the idea of genocide, was intended by Raphael Lemkin. It's not how it's framed in the Genocide Convention. According to the criteria of the convention, very clearly Israel meets most of those criteria, and it's very plausible. It has been argued authoritatively many times that Israel is committing genocide according to the criteria of the convention. But in the popular mind, and especially maybe in the German popular mind, because of Israel's guilt about the Holocaust, Germany's guilt about the Holocaust, there is this equation, and there is a reluctance to say that Israel is committing genocide because that connects it to the Holocaust. I would say that when we make the claim that Israel is committing genocide, we're not saying it is exactly like the Holocaust. Amos Goldberg and Daniel Blattman, two Israeli Holocaust historians, wrote an article saying there is no Auschwitz in Gaza, but it's still a genocide. And that basically is the position. Genocide is a broad phenomenon, which has many different forms, many different dimensions, and each case is usually very distinctive. There are these are historical events. They're not. It's not a football match. It's not an election. It is run according to rules. It's something that happens in its own way, and this is true in Gaza.
And it's also like a term that doesn't easily lend itself to activism, right? I mean, despite the fact that the Gaza genocide has become a rallying cry of the Palestine solidarity movement internationally, it is probably difficult for many activists to stomach your description of subaltern genocide, because it kind of, it doesn't equate the colonizer versus colonized dynamic, but it certainly applies genocide in a different way than many people would.
I think that's obviously true. Yes, it's obviously true that the pro-Palestinian movement has not thought deeply until recent times about the idea of genocide, and therefore, people are coming things from all sorts of different directions, and don't always take on board the sort of more complex picture, I suppose, which I'm trying to portray. So I accept that, but I think it's very important that genocide should be a political idea which is accessible to those who seek justice for grave atrocities. And that was the context in which Raphael Lemkin proposed it. He's known as someone who sought to establish the crime of genocide in international law. He's known actually also as a writer on genocide. He establishes it really in a sociological sense, in outline at least. But he, from the start, before even he proposed the idea of genocide, he had the idea that there was a necessity for a language to talk about atrocities, large-scale, holistic atrocities. And genocide was his final attempt to do that. He even in the 1920s, he was writing about a Ukrainian Jew who murdered a Ukrainian nationalist leader who was responsible for huge pogroms against the Jews in Ukraine after the First World War. And this man had carried out this assassination because he saw it as a way of getting revenge or of achieving justice for the Jews who had died at the hands of this leader and his movement. And Lemkin said we need a better way of providing justice, not just legal justice, but law as a means of justice in a broader sense for the victims.
And do you think that just to pick very concretely, that's a good line, but do you think the UN Genocide Convention has delivered on that? Is it that? Because anyone who's read that text, the Axis Rule in Occupied Europe by Lemkin, knows that the Genocide Convention is a very reduced version of what Lemkin has in mind. Right?
Yes.
Do you think it still serves that justice?
Well, it does, but not to the extent that it should. I mean, you're absolutely right that the Genocide Convention is a reduced version of Lemkin's original idea. His original ideas were more radical, and it would be better if the Genocide Convention had reflected them more. And there are all sorts of ways in which we could improve the convention. So I think the convention, though, should not be dismissed. It provides a framework within which it is possible to call perpetrators to account. The International Court of Justice failed in the Bosnia case to find the broad process of the destruction of Bosnian Muslim and Croat society to be genocide, but it did say that the massacre at Srebrenica was a case of genocide. So we have this concrete example of the convention delivering, I think, in not in a fully adequate way, but nevertheless it delivered a verdict which is a very important precedent. And so I think that international law can be used, and so I think it's very important that South Africa has brought its case. I think it's going to be difficult for the International Court of Justice to dismiss this case, although there will be all sorts of ways in which Israel's lawyers and their supporters will try to do that.
When you say it's going to be difficult to dismiss this case, is this a prediction already that they're going to rule it?
Well, I don't know what they're going to rule.
Right.
I can see it going either way. I mean, we as I mentioned in the Bosnia case, I think that the arguments that were made by the court not to have a broader finding of genocide about the whole Bosnian genocide were deplorable, were inadequate, and so it was a half victory for justice, really, that case. And it may be that we find something else similar in the Israel case, but I think it's going to be difficult for the court to dismiss the arguments of South Africa's lawyers, and that's why Israel and the United States have made such efforts to force South Africa to withdraw the case, to put pressure on them to back off.
And put sanctions on the ICC and the
yes, in the separate cases in the ICC against Netanyahu and his former defense minister. They have been even blunter. They have imposed direct sanctions on the court, on the judges, on the chief prosecutor, and others. So this is so. I think this shows that they still fear international justice, and. But I would say that the Palestine movement, the anti-genocide movement, should not rest all its hopes on international justice. This cannot be done through law alone. It is a case where the political campaign of the pro-Palestine movement has to have its own voice, and it has to proclaim the genocide here and now. In order to put pressure on Israel, but more importantly, maybe on Western countries and other countries to follow through on the recognition of the atrocities that have been committed and to bring them to an end.
You're saying, if not law, what is the other option to put pressure?
Well, it's politics, really, isn't it? It's politics. I mean, it would be a mistake to rest all our hopes on law. I think that's obvious. There needs to be political pressure. There is political pressure. There needs to be bigger political pressure. The Palestine movement in Western countries and elsewhere needs to find ways of making a greater impact. I think we're already in a situation where Western governments are pulling back from Israel to a certain extent, and are becoming more verbally critical of Israel, but they are not following through by imposing the sort of sanctions, by withdrawing from military cooperation. And we have dynamics like. That even as President Trump is actually becoming a little bit critical of.
You're saying sanctions would be a good idea for.
I think it's essential. I mean, if any other state was committing genocide, would they not be sanctioned? Would they not be cut off from the international community?
Well, there is another state that whose actions you actually have called genocidal as well, which is Russia, right? And there have been sanctions on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine.
Yes.
Also interesting, because I think, explain this to me, because when you look at on social media, and this is less theoretical kind of observation, but the kind of strongest proponents of Israel, who is still sort of defending, or if not defending Israel's actions, so at least kind of shielding against the stronger accusations like apartheid, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. They often have, you look at their social media profiles, and they often have an Israeli flag next to a Ukrainian flag. So the kind of Western alliance is built in a sense that it is not actually a solidarity that encompasses both the victim of the Russian invasion and the Palestinian, the Israeli invasion, but it's like it's a kind of selective solidarity.
Yes.
How do you explain this? Because if I understand you correctly, like the invasion of Ukraine was genocidal, and to some extent, the invasion of Gaza is genocidal. Like how do you explain this constellation?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's quite normal. It's widespread. I think we find that. It's certainly normal when it comes to states and political leaders. That they don't take a serious position or a serious principled position in favour of international justice, in favour of applying norms like genocide or apartheid consistently across cases. They go on their geopolitical alliances. So Israel is embedded in the Western system of power, maybe to an extent which we weren't completely aware of 3 years ago. Israel is so integrated in economically, culturally, as well as politically and ideologically, through the deference which is paid to anti-Semitism and Holocaust commemoration and these sorts of things. Israel is so essential to the Western alliance that even that many politicians who recognise the enormity of what Russia has done in Ukraine will defend Israel. But on the other side, we find people who will support Palestine but will not recognise the atrocities that Russia is committing in Ukraine, will not recognise that in Ukraine Russia intended to eliminate a distinct Ukrainian state, society, culture. They haven't been completely successful because of the resistance, because of the support that Ukraine has had from the West. But Israel has been successful, more or less, in Gaza because there this Western support has been for the perpetration of genocide. So we have this sort of inconsistency, but it is there in the Palestine movement. Some people who will not support Ukraine, who are still have illusions about Russia. There are states who support Palestine, but I mean Russia itself, nominally at least, supports Palestine. This sort of hypocrisy is institutionalized throughout the world system, throughout the international system.
It is fascinating how this conflict is playing out, in the sense that Russia is, of course, the state that followed the Soviet Union, which has long been seen as the one remaining bulwark against American imperialism, and this specific constellation of like how there are remnants of that thinking today in many of the supporters of in the quote unquote global South, and the supporters of colonized places like Palestine that see Russia as a power that cannot itself be imperial, but as you lined out, I think quite well.
Yeah, and we have seen, we've seen Russia under Putin supporting the Syrian dictatorship and its brutal repression through many years. There are many examples of this, but there are still those who find it difficult to criticize.
I'm wondering one last question. The field of genocide research has taken quite some time to call the Gaza genocide a genocide. I'm honestly not sure if there still is a credible genocide researcher out there, at least in the public sphere, who still denies that. And I think you've hinted on that throughout the conversation. Do you think is there hope for this specific field on your part right now, that like the experience of the past 3 years will reinvigorate the field of genocide research in a way that it will think about certain questions in a deeper way?
Well, I hope so. Yes, I mean, I think the experience of the last 3 years and the, if you like, the repoliticization of the idea of genocide have caused all sorts of problems for the field. The field is under a lot of pressure. I talked in a genocide series in a German university yesterday, but that's the only series of that kind that's been held in Germany, and maybe in Europe in the last 3 years. The discussion of genocide has become more difficult because university administrators are worried about how that will be perceived by political interests outside the university. So the field has responded, but it faces new challenges. I'm hoping that within the field, this will lead to a more serious thinking about the scope of genocide. I think in the decades up to 2023, there had been a tendency to sideline conceptual questions, to sideline the discussion of genocide as a concept of what it means for a genocide to take place, and simply to get on with studying the particular cases, with doing the history, doing the analysis.
It's so interesting to me. Yeah. How is that possible that you can sideline the conceptual?
Because the genocide studies is a label for, if you like, a field of it might be called mass atrocity studies, or political violence studies, and there are lots of alternative terminologies, and people were moving in the direction of adopting those terminologies. And Dirk Moses' book, The Problems of Genocide, in 2021, was actually a call for the field to abandon the idea of genocide and to replace it with permanent security.
Right.
And I think that was a mistake. I think it was a mistake made for good reasons, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of in his critique which was valid, but I think the conclusion was a mistake. And I think the last two or 3 years have shown that the idea of genocide is still very, very important. That, like it or not, if it didn't exist, we would have had to invent it. And when we deal with situations like Gaza, we need it. And therefore, in the coming years, we will need to expand our understanding of the idea, to refocus on the conceptual discussion, to if you like, to get back to some of the basics.
Well, I think you are clearly, undeniably, a leading voice in that movement of trying to reinvigorate the field, and I'm very grateful for your early interventions. I think that should really be emphasized, that you were one of the first people who really engaged with that question when it comes to Gaza, and I'm very thankful you came here today. This is the book. You can read it up, and thanks.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a very interesting discussion.
Great.
I hope your listeners and viewers appreciate it.
Thank you.